Have you ever felt like a nobody? Someone that you could fade from the scene and few, if any, would notice, would miss you. Maybe we start to think that no one cares for us. The only thing that's important is what they think they're going to get out of us. That's a lonely feeling, isn't it? That's an empty feeling. I remember days when I was in college and such as that was very, very, very lonely, very empty, wondering if there was any use. And this morning, I want to look with you at the experience of a young woman who had every reason to feel like a nobody. And I believe that we're going to see through her example, through her story, that in God's eyes, everyone is a somebody. And everyone has the ability, or actually God has the ability through every one of our lives to touch and even transform people far beyond we might think is possible. So let's look at this today. We're going to be in the book of Acts. We're going to be reading from the 16th chapter in just a moment. This woman we're going to read about, let me just say, she didn't even have freedom. And every teenager of you is saying, yeah, join the club. No, we're talking about more than just mom and dad got you under their thumb. She didn't have her freedom. Spiritually, she had been exposed, opened in her life to spiritual forces that had also imprisoned her, and she could not escape. But when she started telling others the one spiritual truth she had found, it changed her life, it changed the community, and it's still changing the world today. So here in the book of Acts, the 16th chapter, we're going to begin reading in verse 16. And you will notice that we're reading and all of a sudden you're going to see the first person plural. The author of the book of Acts, Dr. Luke, happens to be tagging along at this point in the story. It says, once when we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune telling. She followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved." She kept this up for many days. Finally, Paul became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the spirit, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." At that moment, the spirit left her. When her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, "These men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice." Now hold your Bible open there, if you will. We're going to come back and read a little further in the story. But let's just right here take a moment and talk about what's going on and where we're at. Physically, the story takes place in a city called Philippi. It's in the ancient province of Macedonia. If you happen to look at a map of the Mediterranean world, it's up. You've got Greece that sits there sticking out into the Mediterranean Ocean, and then there's a little bit of Greece that comes back to the right, and it sits up in here along the old Ignatian Road that the Roman Empire, one of their great roads that they could travel with their armies and with trade so quickly. It was an important place in that day, although it's pretty much a ruin today. Philippi was an important place politically because Julius Caesar, when he had sought to set up himself as the emperor, as the Caesar, there had been a dramatic and climactic battle about 40 years or so before Jesus was born, right there nearby. And so Philippi was an important place in the world of that day. Paul hadn't intended to be in Philippi. He had thought that as he was on a mission trip and he's coming from the east, that he's going to go up into Asia Minor. He's going down into Asia Minor. He's actually going across the top. And he's going to drop down into Asia Minor and he's going to preach there. And it tells us earlier that he tries to make some turns down. He's trying to drop in to Asia Minor. God, you called me to preach. You sent me out on a mission trip, and here I am. I'm going there. And again, the door was closed, and he didn't know what to do. And then one night he had a dream. And the dream was of a man from Macedonia saying, "Come over here and help us. Come over here and help us." So, Paul and his party, they concluded that's what God wanted them to do. And so they traveled and they came up to that area, and there they sought to find someone to even talk to about Jesus. And if you back up and you read the story, beginning in verse 11, you'll discover that they didn't have much luck. Most of these big cities in the Roman Empire would at least have a population of Jews, and they would gather together to worship God in a Jewish house of worship called a synagogue. It's something like a local church. And they would gather and they would study the Old Testament, their Torah, and they would worship God. But here in Philippi, there weren't even enough Jewish men to do that. And so Paul had a word, though, right, from God. He's supposed to be there. So he starts digging around, and they decide to go down outside the city wall, go down near the river. Every one of those ancient cities would be near a river because they needed water, and they didn't have nice deep wells like we do today. And so they went down and they found a place where people prayed. And they met a few women. And one of them, a woman by the name of Lydia, they began to talk to. Paul shared with her about Jesus, and she turned to Jesus. She was a businesswoman, an important person. And all of that household turned to the Lord too. And she invited them to come and to stay in her big hacienda, so to speak, her big house, while they were ministering in Philippi. Well, they were doing what they could with a place that there wasn't even much of a way to get started ministering. And it says, there we read it in verse 16, once when we were going to the place of prayer, that place outside the city wall, that place down by the river, all of a sudden there's this woman. And she is an unusual woman. First of all, it tells us that she's a slave. She's demon-possessed. And you can drop in that first line there, Jason. She's demon-possessed so that she can read the future. Not that she could know the future, but you know, demons are pretty good at knowing what we would like to do. They know our past behavior, and they can predict what we're going to do in the future pretty well. The devil's the best fisherman in the world. He knows what lure will catch you. And this woman, this slave woman, this possessed woman, suddenly she begins to follow Paul and Silas and the others through the streets of the city, shouting. Imagine them walking behind them. And this isn't a big city like we would think of. You go to San Antonio, you go to Houston, or even Victoria, and you got the cars and trucks and the buses and everything honking, and you got to shout to be heard, right? Well, there's going to be a hubbub here. There's going to be some noise in the city. You're going to have some animals carrying on and people talking, but someone shouts, everyone's going to notice. And here she is walking behind them, shouting, it says, these men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved. How strange is that, right? She didn't know the way to be saved. But God had shown, the demon somehow had said something to her, and she knows what's going on. She's a woman of low station in life. She's a slave. She's a woman of dark associations in the spiritual realm, and she has no apparent shame about letting people know, listen, I got something evil inside of me that knows what's going on. Scary, right? The closest parallels in all the Bible that I can find to what she was doing were the spirits that were occupying people in the days of Jesus in the Gospels. And he'd start to deal with those people, and they'd go, I know who you are, son of man. He'd say, shut up and get out, before they could say much about it, right? There's no evidence that Paul had had an experience personally with any of these sorts of things, these sorts of demons. This woman was someone unlike anyone else really recorded in the book of Acts. She's bold, she's loud, she's a nobody though. She's literally struggling with her demons. You know, we throw that around pretty lightly, don't we? She's literally struggling with her demons. You know, as a minister, I've got to tell you, I don't envy Paul this one. Every preacher likes to have one or two or three they can talk about. They're trophies. People who were really in a dark place and God turned them around. This is dark. This is embarrassing. For the rest of his life, after what we're going to read in a little bit, Paul would be able, if he was able to get a mirror and look, he'd be able to say, you see that scar right there? I got that one, and that one, and that one in Philippi because of her. He was going to make a mark on him, literally. So anyway, day after day after day, we don't know how many days, Luke makes it sound like Paul put up with it for maybe longer than he would have. Paul finally got annoyed. He turned around and he told that demon, just get on out of here. We could ask questions about why didn't he do it right off the bat. I don't know. I don't know. God had told him you go preach. And he tried to go into Asia Minor several times, and God kept telling him, not here, not here, not here. Maybe it was one of those things like that. I don't know. But finally, Paul had had enough. And he told that demon, get out of her. Leave her alone. And she was set free. That unexpected result. I don't know that the woman had any idea what she was saying or doing, like she had some kind of hope that she would be liberated. Did she even have a capacity? The word, you know, we read this word and it says saved, but it's a broader word than that. You do the study of the word and it would also mean healed, made whole. The woman didn't even know what she was saying. It was a demon speaking out of her mouth. But she was liberated. She wasn't asking for it, even though she was asking for it. Had the woman longed for the soul's freedom that she found that day? We don't know. Unfortunately, Luke takes another turn with the story. That isn't where he goes. All he tells us is that in obtaining her freedom, she lost her connection to the dark realm she'd been tapped into. And suddenly, she can't tell the future anymore. That portal in her spirit is just closed off. Don't you reckon that felt a little spooky to her? Made her feel a little abandoned? Sometimes the dark things, we get so comfortable with the dark things in our lives that when we say, all right, I want to turn toward the light, it can feel like that darkness is our best friend, and we're tempted to turn back to it. Watch out. Watch out. That's a dangerous, dangerous place. She couldn't make money for her masters anymore. She couldn't predict the future. And somewhere along the way, they got angry about it. Whether it was right away, she said, I can't do it anymore. Or whether she sat down or a few, however she handled it, seances, whatever she did, I don't know, and I don't want to know. I just know that she couldn't tell people the future anymore. And her bosses said, wait a minute, her owners, we know why. And we're going to extract our pound of flesh out of those outsiders, those guys that came here and she followed around for weeks or days or whatever it was. I sort of like to fill in the story. I've told you about that before. I like to just sort of imagine out the rest of things like this. I just like to imagine Lydia, that other woman that had come to the Lord earlier, or members of her household, or others who had trusted in Jesus. That Paul and Silas had introduced this young woman to them. And they said, here, let us help you. We're going to put you on another path. We're going to help you understand another way to live. We're going to help you understand this new freedom you have found in Jesus. She wasn't looking for it. She didn't know she needed it. But there it was. Her masters may have considered her worthless now, but in Jesus, she was just beginning to recognize how valuable she really was. What Luke does help us learn, though, as the story goes on, is that out of every salvation, out of every liberation, of even the most unexpected nobody, glorious things can happen. Unforeseen benefits may occur. This woman, she didn't anticipate any of what would happen next. And the story picks up in verse 22. It says, the crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cells and fastened their feet in the stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourselves. We are all here." The jailer called for lights, rushed in and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all his household were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. What other unforeseen benefits were there to what had happened to this woman? Well, short term, the results are quite painful. We've already talked about them a little bit, about what Paul and Silas experienced. Their backs stripped, beaten with rods, put in the stocks, thrown into the prison overnight. But then we read of a jailhouse worship service, of an earthquake, doors springing open, chains falling off, the desperate jailer about to take his life because he figured he could take it quicker than those that wanted to get to him for what he had allowed to happen would. Paul called out. And there's something we don't want to miss right here in verse 30. It says that after he brought them out, he asked them, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Let me ask you, how did he even know to ask that question? How did he even know to ask, "What must I do to be saved?" I'll tell you how. Because there'd been a slave woman following them around in the street for days, yelling, "These men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved." That's how he knew. He'd overheard it, whether in person or someone told him about it. And all he knew when he realized that they were still there, not only them but all the prisoners, was that he needed what they had to offer. And he opened his heart to Jesus that night. And that was just the beginning. You know, the church at Philippi, the church that was formed in this situation, Paul didn't get to hang around. Basically, after all this was over, they begged him, the leaders of the town said, "Would you please leave?" And he did. But the church that was left became one of Paul's favorites. You need to read, if you haven't read, the little letter called Philippians. And you see how much Paul loved this church and how much they loved him. And how many times they had taken up offerings and sent them to support this missionary who was traveling about, laying his life on the line so that others could hear like they did about Jesus. Why, they even had one of their own men, a fellow by the name of Epaphroditus. He packed up and he carried one of those offerings, and they told him, "You stay with Paul and you help him in his ministry." All birthed out of not just one, but two women, Lydia and a slave woman. We don't even know her name. We don't even know her name. Here's the point. You may think yourself a nobody. But God knows your name. God knows your past. God knows your potential. And He's given Jesus. You can make a positive difference for yourself, for your family, and for many others that you can't even begin to imagine by turning to Jesus. By telling others what you have found. And by trusting God to do what He desires with the results. You are somebody in God's eyes. Don't forget that. Don't believe the lies that darkness can can speak into your heart and your mind when you just don't see which way to go forward. You're somebody with God. There may be hardships that you're going to find when you embrace this sense of purpose, but you're going to find that there's blessing. You're going to leave a legacy of faith in your wake. And one day, there's going to be God's own well done. His well done, good and faithful servant.